Okay guys, so in this video I'm going to walk through a roadmap for front-end developers as basically a response to a request I got from one of my subscribers who was wondering if I could walk through this for him and just explain the different steps, and I thought that by just looking at this I can see that this is a fairly inclusive list of topics for a front-end developer, and I think that I can add some thoughts to this and probably provide some type of guidance in terms of what's actually relevant and how you should think about these things. So let's get started. So the first and foremost thing we want to do is that we want to define what is a front-end developer. Well, from the perspective of this roadmap seems to be the front-end developer is somebody who is exclusively learning, virtually working in the front-end part of an application. So we can see here that it starts off by saying learn the basics, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now I can tell you right now that if you want to be a professional software developer, this is incorrect. This is not true. These are the basics of what a front-end developer does, but I would say that today just knowing this will not give you a job. Even learning this entire roadmap will not give you a job. This is something that you specialize in order to work mainly on the front end, but you cannot just learn these things you see on this roadmap here and think that you're going to get a job. You might be able to, but I find it very unlikely that that's going to happen, because for every single front-end position that I've had myself or I've seen others, basically you cannot have a front end without the server. You need to know the back end as well as what's going on here. So I'm just putting that out there. This is great if you want to get really good at UI development and so forth, but you still need to learn a server-side language. That is, there's no way you're going to get around that. Anywho, let's talk about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. These are absolutely good starting points. These are the bare bone basics of doing UI development on the web. Let's look at this next node here. So it forks off to CSS here, which apparently now includes responsive web, which is great. I agree 100% with this. In order for you to be able to effectively work with a UI layout in the web today, you need to know what responsive layout is, and that is where media queries comes in and all kinds of different techniques to make a web page responsive, basically, which is I 100% agree with this. Then we have preprocessors, and basically what a preprocessor is it used to be the case that, or rather it is the case that today the browser only supports CSS files, but CSS files can get really messy, they can get really, really big, and it's very tedious to have one big massive super CSS file. So the industry came up with preprocessors, which are basically, think of it as an extension on CSS that allows you to do more stuff, like use variables and loops and all kinds of other stuff, and actually have multiple CSS files that then are combined into one big CSS file, and then you can ship that to the client. It's just really a way to make your development experience as a programmer nicer and make you more productive. So here we see that the top one here is Sass. And then you have less styles than post CSS, and I absolutely agree with this. Sass is the oldest of the preprocessors, or one of the oldest, and it's probably still the most popular one out there. It's not the sexiest one. The sexiest one right now is post CSS. The other two are out there, but not as present as Sass and post CSS. So these are very good technologies. If you need to pick one, start with Sass, because you can then transition into post CSS afterwards. Let's look at frameworks. So here we have a mistake immediately. By just stating this entire column here is misdirecting a junior, at least from my perspective, immediately. So Foundation, Bootstrap, Materialize, CSS, and Semantic UI. These are, from the author's perspective, the things that you should learn. And although I agree that if you need to learn a CSS framework, Bootstrap should be your first stop because it's the oldest and most established one. But there's a more fundamental problem with just stating something like this, because the question really comes down to, why would you need this framework? What would make you want to learn this? Well, it used to be the case that Bootstrap, the main reason why people used Bootstrap back in the day was because it was very difficult to make a good responsive layout. But the CSS standard has been extended with things such as Flexbox and CSS Grid, so that today Bootstrap is almost completely pointless. If you're starting a new project today and you use a CSS framework, you should ask yourself why you're using that CSS framework. I would argue that the only time you should learn a CSS framework today is if you don't have the time to create a custom design. That's what you want to do. So let's say that you just want to get something really quickly up. You don't care about making it look exactly the way that you want it or something like that. You just want a standard layout, something that looks pretty that somebody else has already done for you, then these frameworks are perfect because they're going to save you a lot of time. You don't have to like pick colors and fonts and all that stuff. All that stuff is going to happen through these CSS frameworks, but they are not a hard requirement to be a front-end developer. I would even go as far as to say that there are more companies out there who want to have their own look and feel to their layout than there are companies using these frameworks. Let's see here. Then we have the other side of this, which is getting deeper into JavaScript. ES6 is absolutely something that you should know about, which is it's the new standard for JavaScript, and it's pretty much supported in all the browsers at this point. Then we have another little fork here for TypeScript and Flow. This thing here is, I would say, utter bullshit. The TypeScript is absolutely the most popular typing system out there for JavaScript at this point, and Flow is getting a lot of traction as well. But I would argue that it's actually, from my perspective, it's actually very uncommon that TypeScript is used in traditional applications. Think of it this way: if you are a beginner and you start learning TypeScript, just by looking at this, you don't really know why TypeScript is so useful. I would argue. I would argue that it's much more sane for you to discover the limitations of JavaScript on your own and then figure out that TypeScript is a good idea, because TypeScript is a good idea. But I can tell you from first-hand experience that it's not as wide a industry standard as you may think that from just looking at this list here. Because just reading this roadmap here kind of makes me feel like we are valuing TypeScript as much as something like maybe npm or something like this, and it's not even in the same ballpark. I've been working in this industry for several years and I've never used TypeScript, rather not in production at least, because the value of TypeScript really only matters to you as a developer if your company wants to use TypeScript. And I would say there are more companies who are not using TypeScript than there are companies using TypeScript. A lot of people talk to me about, yeah, they are thinking about starting to use TypeScript because there is a really big benefit to using it, and I think that there is a really good, like, massive benefit to it, but it's far from some type of industry standard. So I would say, as a beginner, skip this, and when you're a little bit more mature and you or if you get to a company where they actually use TypeScript, learn it then. Much simpler for you, I would argue. Then let's see here, task runners. So we have npm scripts, gulp, and grunt. And I can tell you right now that these things here are fairly relevant. This is a little bit opinionated, I would say, because from my perspective, the most up-to-date as of now way of doing task running in JavaScript land is actually to use the npm scripts solely. And gulp and grunt is probably one of the older ones here for doing various tasks and so forth. And the way that I think about it is this: regardless of where you go as a front-end developer, when you come to a project, one of these three are going to be the thing that is being used in the project or like the company that you're starting to work at. I've even seen like several times where gulp and grunt are at the same, they're used in the same project, because people started out with grunt and then they got sold the idea of using gulp because it's faster, and then you have some people still who are using npm scripts and so forth. So I would say learn npm scripts. It's the standard. These other two are actually, in my opinion, not useful anymore. Like there's nothing you can't really do with npm script that you can't. These two don't really bring much in terms of value to you anymore. But they are. You should be aware of that. There are a lot of projects out there, a lot of companies who are using one of these two or even both of them. So learn them if you need to, but start with npm scripts. It's much more useful. Let's take a look at the package manager. Okay, so yarn and npm, which is absolutely correct. And I personally say that you can stick with npm because yarn is, I know it's the flavor of the month and everybody thinks it's really awesome and it's so popular, but npm have basically patched up all the issues that, well, most of the issues anyway, from my perspective, that yarn was solving in the first place. And I would rather stick with the standard because npm is the standard for doing node, basically anything you want to do with node and so forth. So but in all honesty, you can pick whichever you want of these. I personally stick with npm because, as I said, it's the standard. And until yarn gives me something that I don't like, I mean, the differences are so small. I've never ever experienced any problems with npm that I felt that motivated a change to yarn. But I use yarn and npm interchangeably, and honestly, you can learn yarn in an afternoon or like a few minutes if you know npm. So let's move on. Testing. So here we are. So Jest, Mocha, Jasmine, and Enzyme. All right, you can immediately see here that, all right, so Jest, Mocha, Jasmine, Enzyme. Okay, they thinking about these as equals are not actually that accurate. I would say that Mocha used to be the most popular testing framework for JavaScript, and it's still very, very popular, but I see more and more people moving over to Jest. I myself have moved over to Jest as well because it's a much, much better development experience. It's much more powerful than Mocha, and it has support for it. Virtually has everything under one package. If you go with Mocha, you need to learn a few other libraries in order to do the same thing that you can learn from Jest. So, and Jasmine, I mean, it's even hilarious. Just trust me. Stick with Jest. It's going to give you everything you want. And if you do React development or something like component-based development, you can take a look at Enzyme, but start with Jest, and only really, I really only use Enzyme when I work in React land, when I test out my React components. So I don't think that this is a hard requirement. I say if you're going to learn one testing framework, learn Jest. It's hands down my favorite one. Alright, let's take a look at module loader bundlers. Webpack, rollup, parcel, require.js, browserify. This is a very good this is a nice outline of the more popular bundlers out there, and I would say that you can skip all of these down here and just focus on Webpack. Webpack is the most powerful one on the market today, and it's although it's very complicated, I'm sorry to say, it is hands down the most popular module loader that we have. Every single company I've ever worked for or ever talked to use Webpack. Anyway, choose a framework. Let's take a look at the JavaScript framework. So Angular, React, Vue, Preact, Ember.js, and these are just a fraction of the frameworks that are out there. Before you go into this, though, I want to tell you that start by learning real JavaScript before you get into these frameworks, because otherwise you will just cripple your ability to work effectively as a front-end developer, because there are still I think that a lot of people kind of default to these these JavaScript frameworks without actually thinking it through. And I would like you to avoid that, because otherwise you might find yourself being an Angular front-end developer and you don't. I mean, if I ask you to come help me with something that is actually being done in regular JavaScript, you can't, because you've basically crippled yourself. I see tons of developers who only know how to work in WordPress and they still call themselves professionals. In my opinion, you are not a professional if you can't work outside of a very specific set of tools. Then you're just a developer who knows that tool suite. It's not bad or anything like that, but if your goal is to be a true professional, just learning one framework or just being able to work in one thing, that's not going to cut it. At least not in my opinion. Ideally, what you want to do is that you want to learn JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, and be really good at that first, and then transition into these frameworks when you realize when you get your bearings, basically. But Angular and React are very good solutions for, or rather, first picks. I would say start with one over the other. Just pick one of them. My personal favorite is React, and it's the most popular one on the market today. Angular is coming in as a fairly strong second, but it's losing a little bit of traction from my perspective. So I would personally stick with React. These two are completely out. So yeah, if you're doing Angular, I suppose that once again you have TypeScript here. Don't really see why TypeScript isn't a good solution for one of the others, but that then again I haven't made this list really. RxJS, it's also, yeah, if you want to go into that, you can do so. I don't agree with this at all, actually. I don't see why these are hard requirements to do Angular development. I did Angular development for several years, and I don't really see, I never needed to use any of this to produce production level code. But if you want to learn it, that's, I, you have my blessing, sorry. And then we see, okay, so Flux, Redux, and MobX. All right, Redux, this is, I agree 100% with this. Redux is by far the most popular. Next, basically, Redux is a way to manage state in React land. There are actually Redux and Flux flavors for Angular as well, but Redux and React, they are like bread and butter, peanut butter and jelly. They go hand in hand. I would skip MobX altogether, because even though it is in theory, or rather on paper, they try to prove that they're doing something that is more sophisticated than Redux, the performance game that they're trying to play, I haven't really been convinced that this is such a big benefit, because the beautiful thing about Redux is that not only is it the biggest and most popular addition to the React environment, but it's also very simple. You could, if you know the theory behind Redux, you can actually build it yourself in less than 5 minutes. And I think that simplicity outweighs all the complexity the MobX brings to the table. But that's just my opinion. MobX isn't a bad choice, but I think that Redux is the stronger of the two. Now let's move on. Let's go to methodologies. So here we have the last node. So here we have something for CSS. And let's look at methodologies. This I agree with 100%. BEM is probably the best thing you can learn when you're starting to learn CSS. It stands for Block Element Modifier, and it is my absolute favorite CSS architecture, or methodology to structuring CSS. These other ones are okay as well. Like SMAX is pretty nice, and object-oriented CSS is pretty okay, but BEM is the one that really stuck with me. This is my absolute favorite one. And then we have a deep dive into CSS3. I think this is a little bit weird, because the way that I think about it is that there's no reason for you to like section this off and not learn flexbox and scale and rotate and so forth. I think that it's much more natural that what you're going to do is that you're going to start building things. And when you start building things, you will realize that, hey, I need to be able to do certain things. And then you'll go out and Google for solutions to actually building the thing that you're trying to build, and most likely you're going to find code examples or people who can show you how to do something, and they're going to touch on these topics just as well as any other CSS trickery that is needed in order to provide the results that you want. So I don't think that you should, like, this is, I don't see why we would section these two, like the basic CSS off from this section here, because it's, CSS is CSS. You need to learn most of it, rather the things that you use in CSS are the things that you use in order to build something. So if you're building something and you don't know how to build that, you're going to learn flexbox very quickly, most likely, or gradients or grids or whatever, just because you're trying to do something that you don't know how to do. And if that thing includes, for example, flexbox, then you're going to learn it. So don't take this with a pinch of salt. SVG, alright, so SVG is probably, it's very, very good for you to know SVG. It is my favorite way of presenting like icons and anything that isn't like a real photograph or something like that. SVG is on the rise, and it's I would say more or less an industry standard today to provide all type of graphics and so forth to a web page through the SVG system. Then we have D3. I would say that this is very, very optional. It's something that I would ignore D3 altogether because it really only has one really good use case, and that is if you want to do graphs. If you want to do like charts and stuff of that nature, then you should look at D3, and there's tons of libraries that use D3 as the base, and then they wrap their own styling and components in around D3. So I would ignore D3 altogether, honestly, unless and learn it only when you actually need to do it. And then finally we have a section here for design patterns. I don't have any idea what like design patterns. What's that? I don't really know. And then regex is apparently very optional. I would disagree 100% with that. Regex is a part of JavaScript. Therefore, if you're learning JavaScript, you're going to learn regexes. You don't have to master them. Nobody knows, as far as I know, like every single regex combination by heart. They're a very tricky subject, but there are plenty of tools that make them fairly easy to get right. And more design patterns, don't really know about that. Learn different testing techniques. These are a little bit vague for me. I don't really know what this is all about, but I can agree to a point to learn different testing techniques. That is valuable. Although I will say that from my experience, most front-end projects have spotty unit testing. Mostly in the this is kind of bad. I'm not advocating it at all, but for the most part, I see that front end is usually very poorly tested. Testing in the UI layer, very few people are doing that as extensively as they are on the server side. Server or like backend developers, they are usually the ones who do the most amount of testing. I'm not advocating this in any way. I think that you should write all code with the same amount of respect, but that's the way that it looks, at least from my perspective, in the industry today. So hopefully this was useful to you, and I will see you around. Have a great day.